Hello guys. I guess everybody is here and we can start. As earlier meetings, today also there is no specific agenda, but to continue discussion around the rest of the API resources that are possibly part of B2. So last meeting we were still talking about the placement, and we had reached some formative ideas around the same. Just a little recap would be that one way of specifying placement was having a one-to-one relationship where definitive spec is used. It could be a different object or with a object ref to the given object, or it could be part of the spec itself. And all the other directives which include placement or affinity or any additional stuff which might be categorized in placement can be more objects, resources, or different resources. So we can continue from this note onwards.
I was remembering one of the justifications for having a separate placement resource. It wasn't necessarily going to solve all problems, but if I wanted to propagate namespaces selectively without an annotation-based mechanism, we're going to be using like cube namespaces. There's no such thing as a federated namespace, essentially. So you kind of need a placement resource that can be associated with the namespace. That makes sense. All this to say that I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution. Like in most cases, especially around policy, it seems to make sense to have like a one-to-one mapping. I think that was kind of the relevant outcome of the last week's discussion, was talking about one-to-one versus one-to-many. And placement, at least in the base case, I think needs to be one-to-one to support policy. And then maybe it's nice to have one-to-many to make it easier for certain use cases, but I don't think you could do one-to-many and actually just do that. And kind of similar around namespaces. If you wanted to be able to provide placement directives for namespaces, you kind of need a one-to-one relationship, and you can't put it on the namespace because it's not our object. So you need a separate resource.
But wait, I'm
go ahead.
I'm getting a bit lost here, Maru. So first of all, I just want to clarify what we're talking. I mean, namespaces, to take a concrete example, we have at least kind of three notions of federated namespaces. We have the namespaces in the Federation API where you put things that you want federated. And then you have the concept of creating consistent namespaces in multiple clusters. Maybe all your clusters or maybe a subset of your clusters. And then we have this concept of actually, so that's just literally propagating the namespaces themselves to all the clusters, not the contents of the namespaces. And then there's also been talk of propagating everything that is contained within a namespace into multiple clusters, or making the contents of namespaces in multiple clusters consistent in some way. So which of the three are you referring to here?
I guess it could be the latter two. I was mainly thinking of the case where you just wanted to propagate the namespace and not necessarily the contents.
Okay, and in that case, how does that differ from propagating anything else? I mean, up to now, we've been talking about having a federated object, which has as part of it a template for the thing that you want to push into multiple clusters. How are namespaces different than that?
So namespaces are a special case because they can contain things. And the idea of a federated namespace, I don't think, I can't I haven't found a way to rationalize having both a namespace and a federated namespace, because in order to support things like RBAC controllers that work against Cube in the context of federation and new types, we'd have to put in a lot of work. And the way that I've been trying to simplify that problem is just saying a namespace is a namespace is a namespace. We're aggregated with a Cube API that supports namespaces, and we're supporting namespacing in the federated API. But as far as like a first class federated resource with a template for namespaces, that just doesn't exist. Does it make sense? So it's a special case and we have to handle it accordingly.
Yeah, I guess I don't really like special cases in general, and I
agree. But namespaces are a special case.
I don't,
kind of the problem.
I'm not totally convinced that they are special. I'm not, you know, maybe I haven't thought about it enough, but
they are in the context of aggregation. Like the challenge is like namespaces in the context of Cube, like there's no arguing that like, say your labeling proposal is maybe a nicer way to segment an API. But today we have namespaces as a way to do that, and that's kind of generally accepted.
Yeah, but let me put it another way. So this is maybe a slightly silly example, but maybe it illustrates the point. I can imagine creating a namespace object in the federation control plane. And I guess namespaces are by definition not namespaced. So they're like top level objects. They just have a name and they don't live in a namespace, right?
Sure.
And then I can imagine the template inside there saying, this is the thing I want to propagate, being different than the federated thing. I'm kind of, you know, stretching the bounds of what's useful. I'm just, conceptually, that would seem possible in the same way that I could create a federated replica set called foo, and its template inside might be called something different.
But a replica set is just, it's an object that just exists, right? And it's in a namespace. A federated replica set is an object that exists in a namespace. Yeah. And so to me, introducing another concept that can't actually contain things, because we don't really want another special, well, that's preconception, I guess. I guess maybe it would be helpful to explain sort of my thought process. I'm assuming that Federation v2 is going to aggregate with the Cube API. And that gives us things like RBAC and namespaces and other sort of first-class Cube things. We kind of just get those. And so if I think about a federated resource, it will actually live in a Cube namespace. And that enables things like RBAC to work, because essentially the federated resource is just another resource, and RBAC is worrying about, you know, things kind of at a, like, it doesn't really matter which objects RBAC is referring to. If you're working through an aggregated API, you just kind of, it is just another type. So we can add as many types as we want, and we can still manage it with like RBAC as a first-class solution. So my thinking is that having a federated namespace means there's kind of a disjoint between like if I have a federated namespace, maybe it would make sense if it was a one-to-one mapping with a Cube namespace, kind of like how we're having like a cluster from cluster registry has a one-to-one mapping with like a federated cluster, and they just store different things. And maybe that would make sense if, so I guess it's possible. I guess I shouldn't discount it, but does that make sense? Like what I'm envisioning?
Yeah. I guess I'm trying to avoid creating too many special cases. And I also think we need to be very clear on, you know, things like RBAC. You can just say RBAC and federate RBAC, but actually there's quite a few fairly different concepts there. There is what your permissions are in the federation control plane to create.
And that's what I'm referring to. Like I'm not too worried about federated RBAC will be something entirely different. This is just about providing access control for.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
So I guess I should go ahead. Sorry.
I didn't want to interrupt you guys in between. So How about thinking of namespace as two cases? So one is a federated namespace, and the other one is actually a federation namespace. So the concept of namespace, which applies to, say, a K8s cluster to segregate objects or give a segregation for a user or that kind of stuff. The same stuff can apply to the control plane. So a federation namespace is only a federation specific object, and it is not necessarily the same type which will have a template within which corresponds to a K8s object. Whereas a federated namespace is that. So you can treat the namespace exactly like every other object of K8s which we are federating, but we have an additional federation namespace which can provide similar functionality for federation level resources, like scoping them, or for example, you can have multiple federated resources of same names specified within two different federation namespaces. I mean, it might be going too far, but it's just like.
I'd just like to maybe clarify the language. And for me, I think I've just been thinking about a Kubernetes namespace and a federated namespace. And the difference would be a Kubernetes namespace is the universal concept for namespacing, and that exists whether in a member cluster or in the federation control plane. And then a federated namespace would be a special case that sort of, as you say, defines maybe placement or like cluster by cluster, like differences, but like whatever is like can actually control propagation. Does that make sense? Like the two.
Yeah, and I think everything you've described applies to, you know, if you replace the word namespace there with replica set, it makes just as much sense. I wonder whether we shouldn't kind of table this discussion and talk about the general stuff, and then if we want to do namespaces or RBAC or anything else differently than the way we've decided for other things, then we give it some thought. We actually write down our thoughts, because I think otherwise we might kind of go round and round in circles here. I personally haven't given it enough thought yet. I would want to sit down quietly and write down my thoughts somewhere. And maybe now's not the right time to do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to nail down this placement stuff or constraints or whatever you want to call it before too long. I should say that like I've been making progress on the prototyping side, and I have kind of a test bed that kind of has some of the new API elements and reuses some of the like the controller stuff from Federation V1, so that I can, you know, start a federation, which consists of Cube API, Federation API, Cluster Registry API, and then start a controller for like federated secrets, and then create a federated secret, and then actually watch it go to member clusters. I should say the fixture actually has member clusters as well. So that's kind of the step one for me, is just being able to like take a federated resource and create, you know, the associated cube resources and member clusters. The next step is going to be like implementing some mechanism that does overrides. And then the third step will be implementing that something that supports placement. I'm not worrying about scheduling at this point, but I'd like to have something concrete to work on once I get to placement, which won't be hopefully in too long. So it's not that we have to do it today, but I don't really want to have this drag on any more than you do, is all I'm trying to say.
No, sure. Yeah, and maybe we can try and wrap it up next week or something. That sounds good. Okay. Just out of curiosity, so have you implemented a new API, or what does the API of the thing that you've implemented look like roughly?
It looks roughly like the brainstorming exercise.
Okay, so it's got a template and all of that stuff.
Yeah,
okay.
I mean, it's pretty simplistic so far because a lot of it was just getting all the infrastructure in place to be able to propagate.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense to do that. And then at least once we make decisions, we can execute them pretty quickly inside that infrastructure. Cool.
Yeah, okay.
I was actually, without wanting to derail this conversation, I was wondering, we've got quite a few new members here that I certainly don't know the faces or the profiles of all these people. Should we have a quick sort of roundtable introduction thing for the people who may be relatively newer here. There's James and Dario. I think some of us are fairly well known to everyone, but some of us maybe not. Does anyone want to introduce themselves and tell us what they're here for and what they're interested in and where they come from?
Sure, I can start. This is James. So I'm a software architect, and I'm one of the contributors on the Linux Foundation ONAP project, which is Open Network Automation project. In the most recent release, they're migrating a lot of their deployments over to use Kubernetes. And in the subsequent release following that, there's a lot of plans for a lot of the components to have support for geo-redundant or multi-cluster resiliency. So I'm just here to mostly learn whatever I can. That'll help move it forward.
Cool, thank you.
Dario, I work for Amadeus, and we are a strong partner with Red Hat. We are one of the first customer OpenShift for the enterprise solution. And we are following the Federation project because we have a lot of clusters all over the world and we would like to federate them. And that's all. I know Maru and Paul, we have some meeting. So this is one of my personal activity to follow Federation.
Excellent. Yeah, I actually presented Federation at your annual
I know.
engineering conference a couple of years ago.
I know very well.
Yeah. Cool. Anybody else want to say hi? Okay. Carry on, Irfan. Sorry to interrupt.
That's fine. I suggest that until we reach probably a conclusion for this placement, we, as Maru is already doing, we can probably follow what was part of the original proposal Paul and Maru they put out in the document, like placement being a different object with very minimalistic mapping between the resource and the directive.
So does anyone, I don't actually have that document. Can anyone project it or put the link in the chat?
Give me a minute.
Which document we're working from at the moment? Maybe we can just put it in the invite in future so we always have it.
So one quick thing I was curious about, I remember one of the goals of this part of the Federation project was that people would be able to explore different solutions and approaches. Is anyone besides Maru working on prototyping or sort of playing around with this on their own? Or is Maru really the only one doing the sort of the nuts and bolts prototyping?
I'm not aware of anyone other than Maru, but the assumption is that the architecture will be such that if people don't like what Maru's done or what this group does in terms of implementations of controllers or whatever, that the architecture will be such that it'll be fairly easy to build custom ones or different ones, as opposed to the current monolithic kind of approach in version 1, which essentially, everything was bundled into a big controller, so you couldn't easily tease out, placement and templating and status and other things because they're all bundled into a big code.
Yeah, so Jonathan, to dovetail on what Quentin said, I think that part of the challenge here is finding the right primitives that we can compose so that you can to the greatest extent possible, and composition is very challenging to do in a general way, but to the greatest extent possible, if you want a different API for placement, for example, finding a way that you should be able to do that without changing the rest of the stack around it, which may be just a rehash of what Quentin just said. So I will stop talking now.
Yep. So that all makes sense to me. I guess looking at it, I have a maybe concern or I'm wondering if if Maru is the only one doing this prototyping work, and Maru comes out of this work with some product that works, and nobody else has done any exploration of it themselves, most people would just end up going on with what Maru has done because it's done, rather than to explore and like spend time looking at other approaches.
Yeah, I think the reality. Sorry, carry on, Maru.
Sorry, I have just one thing to interject here. I think a lot of there's kind of a barrier to entry around prototyping, which is you need a lot of infrastructure to be able to run a kube server, run a cluster registry, run a federation API, run the controllers, validate that something works. So most of the work in the Fnord repo is about creating reusable stuff to enable experimentation. So up until like today, I would say people would have a really high bar to help or to go, explore things. As of today, I think you actually have like some basis for doing some experimentation if you wanted to do so. And I would encourage anybody who's interested in doing that to contact me, because we are absolutely, Red Hat, just the working group in general, I think we'd all like to have as many people experimenting and prototyping different ideas as possible and proving or disproving like the conceptions that we've been sort of talking about. So does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. That does make sense. Thank you.
I think there's just one comment to add there. I think there's a balancing act between, using all the resources we have available to experiment and not actually producing something that there is any amount of agreement on being the correct way forward. And on the other end of the spectrum, just doing looking at one thing and only, spending any energy on that. So my personal preference and advice would be that we try and have a kind of central one of these things. And I'm, the way it's going, it's looking like it's what this group is going to produce, because there seems to be a reasonable amount of consensus here. And maybe Maru's prototype will, morph into the sort of default alpha implementation, which then obviously everyone can play around with, and we may decide that it's not right, and then we change it because that's what alpha APIs are for. But that it would eventually become, one of the commonly used ones of cluster federation. And if somebody else had people and they didn't like the way that panned out, ideally they should kind of contribute at this point in the project, so that we can ideally come to some consensus. But if that's not possible and there's a minority group that thinks that a different way of doing it is a good idea, at least they'll have the infrastructure to.
Yeah, I would really, I echo Quentin's comments, and I would say like if we had a group that had a strong and different idea for certain parts of this, that would actually be really useful for this group, because it would allow us to more easily see, due to the boundaries of what we're discussing, like break down in the way that we expect them to, so that we can accommodate like two different approaches for parts of the problem space, like we're planning to. It's very tough to do that without a counterexample, to interpret in the context of, like the scheme that we're discussing. So I would take any dissenters, pirates, rebels, or other characters that could present counterexamples on parts of the problem space.
I'm hearing that there's some concern that if we're not constraining the problem, that people will kind of like, there'll just be divergent effort and we won't necessarily be working towards the same goals. And to me, when I talk about experimentation, I'm really talking about like individual pieces. And like, I think that for me, the brainstorming document was a good exercise in breaking apart the problem. And each of those separate sort of pieces, that would be where I would expect experimentation. I wouldn't so much expect like, oh, I'm just going to re-envision the problem in its entirety. It's more like, well, I have some ideas about placement. They're a little bit different from what we've been discussing, or there's kind of like a tangent that we said we didn't want to do that I just want to see if it makes sense or it doesn't. Does that make sense? Like, I would like experimentation in the small, not in the large, and I think that would be helpful in making sure we have a good decision at the end.
Okay, I think that makes sense. Thank you.
Is that is it in line with what you're wanting, Quentin?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's the right way to go about it. I mean, let's face it. Up to now, the problem we've had is in the last year or so is not actually too many people experimenting. The problem has been not enough people actually writing code. So that's what we need to address. And I wouldn't want to fragment the few people we have writing code now to be busy on too many divergent efforts. Should we? I didn't really want to run the show here, but do we have some concrete questions that we haven't answered yet that we want to come to conclusion on, or at least tentatively come to conclusion on today, rather than just discuss general things?
Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you first, Irfan.
Okay. So I was thinking that last 3 meetings, I guess. Yeah, this is the 3rd meeting where we have been talking about placements and not necessarily have come to a solution which can solve everything. So let's keep it what it is right now. Like as I was suggesting, let's just leave placement the way it is and continue thinking about it. And let's move on to the next object, which might need some discussion. For example, the status or scheduling. Does it sound okay?
That does. One thing I might say, has somebody written up, or is there enough detail in the notes that somebody coming back trying to understand the placement discussion could reproduce it? It feels like if it's been discussed over the past 3 sessions, that seems like there's enough information that if somebody could summarize it into a form that other people could look at later, that might be useful.
Jonathan, if you go to the meeting notes that I have been maintaining, I have tried to capture something. If you feel there is something missing, you can please let me know.
Okay.
Or you can yourself. I have seen that Greg has been giving me a helping hand in putting some things which I missed. So I think it's a collective thing. And I think it's like fairly open to all to come into Reddit. So while we are talking, we can actually put something what is being discussed.
Yeah, I'm still, I must be honest, I think I might be saying the same thing as Jonathan here. I'm not clear on how placement as it's represented in the document works. And maybe that I'm being dumb, but is there a concrete example
So,
of?
Yes, I'll share the document. The document that Paul and Maru did represent. Hold on, I'll just share that. And in that placement in the most simple form is a mapping between a resource and or resource selector and a cluster selector. And Paul and Maru, both of you can correct me if I'm wrong. So there are some examples also put over here.
I mean, the placement, the doc really hasn't been updated to sort of take into account some of the discussion we've been having, especially around like how to have a canonical like place to put placement in the case of applying policy. And the whole discussion around like one-to-one versus one-to-many. One-to-many seemed like something that was convenient for applying placement across like all resources, say in an application. Maybe it would be nice for namespaces, as we were talking about earlier. Can't really modify a namespace, Kubernetes namespace object to have placement. But I mean, the discussions we've been having around policy to me suggest that that having a one-to-one mapping maybe makes more sense, at least as a primitive. Like maybe it's nice to have a one-to-many placement mechanism for convenience, but ultimately the primitive is like, where does this resource go? And whatever mechanism determines that, whether it's scheduling or policy or manual like specification, like these all boil down to where do I put this thing? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I have something to add, but I will not talk since Maru just asked a confirming question.
I mean, it's kind of like an obvious question, I hope, or I think, but like, I'm just trying to like baseline that for any given federated resource, we need some indication of which clusters it goes into. That's kind of like the base requirement. And where we put that was the question, and we were kind of toying with the idea of having some, placement resource that could apply to many federated resources. And I'm kind of thinking that maybe that's just not a good first step. And we just focus on like what works in Federation V1. And we just have like a placement field, and it could be, the way that we were originally conceiving of it was you basically have either a selector or like references to cluster federated clusters. And you could have either or, and that would allow like either like a weak association or a strong association, and you would just have to pick one. And does that make sense? As the simplest possible thing. I'm not saying we want to do it, but I'm saying that's the simplest, to my mind, useful implementation of placement for what we're talking about.
I'm not totally comfortable yet with the idea that, it seems pretty, like almost all use cases will involve putting different resource types into the same cluster. I don't know if that's a good way of describing it, but to have a useful deployment into one or more Kubernetes clusters, you typically need, a replica set or deployment and a secret and a service and whatever, more than one thing. And you can't have a useful thing if those things are in different sets of clusters. So if your secrets, end up in the different cluster than the replica set or the deployment that needs them, you don't have a useful system. So it seems to me like the common case would involve making sure that these things are consistent. The placement of multiple resources would be consistently specified. And I did mention that, proximity and those kind of things are, more nuanced than just having the same placement directive. But the very first step is to make sure that all of these things have consistent placement directives. And I'm not sure that having them basically cut and pasted into all of those resources and updating them all, trying to update them all in concert is a good starting point. Does that make sense?
I think I'm trying to separate the problem in my head. Like, sorry, it does make sense. If I'm hearing you correctly, your concern is we're really talking about applications that we're federating. Maybe primitive might be the resource, but we're grouping things together because they depend on one another. There's a dependency graph. I guess I've been thinking
it's not an exceptional situation to want multiple resources to go into the same cluster. It's a common case. So we should cater for the common case.
I guess what I'm trying to separate in my head is the difference between directives to a propagator versus what a user would define. And maybe I should just make that explicit. So if I am a federated secret controller, because that's what I've been working on, I have a federated resource and I have, a collection of clusters, and I need to determine which clusters these secrets are going to go into, or which to propagate to. And so what I really need is for each secret, do you go into this cluster or not? Do you go into this cluster or not? Or what's the set of clusters that you go into, or whatever it is. And to me, that's the lowest level, it's almost like that's a directive for propagation.
Okay, gotcha.
It's most primitive. And then at a higher level, maybe I have, a propagation resource that groups a bunch of resources together.
But that's a placement directive. So I thought that was what we were talking about.
To me, they're kind of logically distinct, because how I define placement.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So I agree that that having a scheduler decide precisely where to put something, and that can be one single thing, is totally reasonable. In the same way that the scheduler in Kubernetes, puts a particular pod on a particular node. But that isn't the level at which, affinity and anti-affinity and all that kind of stuff is specified. That's at the, replica set level.
So maybe would it be helpful or to sort of define language, like placement directive is something that's like user defined, and then a placement decision. I'm kind of thinking about it like it's kind of messed up with scheduling a little bit, because scheduling is more than just that. But to me, like, I guess I've been confusing maybe the two.
Mm-hmm.
And like a declaration is, what I want, and then a decision is what I'm going to get. And I've maybe been worrying too much about the decision. And I'm not particular in how the declaration works, so long as we have an effective way of getting to the decision. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Shall I continue?
Yeah, so concluding, are we falling back to this, that either the scheduler or a controller would have this information calculated or figured out some way, and will remain in with the scheduler or the controller, which is a one-to-one mapping of the placement directive to an object. Whereas whatever is specified by the user or the API is actually a one-to-many placement directive. Is it what we are concluding to now?
I'm just had a thought. I wonder if this makes sense. Maybe like we've been talking about placement resources, and that's kind of a way for declaring intent. What do people think about actually having overrides, not just like overrides for the values of a resource in a given cluster, but also indicating like placement decisions? I'm kind of like trying to separate like the scheduling from the propagator, and this would be kind of a way where the scheduler could write details like placement decisions that then the propagator could respect. Does that make sense at all?
I'm not sure I follow Maru.
I mean, I'm trying to sort of have, like, if I have a placement resource, maybe it's selector based, or maybe it's taking into account affinity, anti-affinity, proximity, that kind of thing. And so there's going to be some mechanism that is going to compute based on, current cluster state, current available clusters, all these details, and is going to figure out this resource should go into this cluster or not. I just want, like, in terms of separation of concerns, like, I want to have a place where that decision can be written.
Yeah. So that was, as I think I might have mentioned before, that was the original design of the Federation control plane, was to do exactly that, to have a federated, replica set, and then have the controller generate individual replica sets, as an example, for each cluster that it decided to put things into, and then some piece of software's job was just to like stamp out whatever it was told to do. Put this replica set with this number of replicas in this cluster. And the scheduler part would decide, which clusters and how big in each cluster and all of those kind of things, templates and things like that. And that was shut down specifically by Brian Grant, who didn't want, and we can certainly revisit the conversation. And I put that proposal forward in the first place, and it was deemed not a good idea. And at the time, I didn't really fight too hard about it because I didn't think it was super important. But the main objection to that was that we now have kind of desired state in two places. So namely that there is, a replica set in the Federation control plane stored in etcd that says, we as a federation decided we want, X number of replicas in cluster Y, and then we propagate that, and then cluster Y has exactly the same thing. It says there's a desire to have this number of replicas in this cluster, and then the same applies to kind of status. So you've got the status of that replica set inside the cluster, and then do you kind of mirror that?
But we're not. I think there's a difference. At least because I remember you talking about this specific case. And I guess I'm hoping, like I would like to have, if you think that Brian's approval on this kind of approach is important and necessary, then I think we should do that.
No,
To
I
me-
don't think it is. I don't think it is, to be clear, but
Okay.
I'm just voicing the
Yeah.
concerns that were voiced at the time, just so that
Yeah.
we're not oblivious to them.
Yeah.
And
I
in
think the
practice-
different, sorry, go ahead.
So in practice, you know, the scheduler, for example, let's call it that, probably needs things like status in order to be able to make its decisions. I mean, certainly at the moment it does. So if it creates a replica set in a cluster and you know, the status of the replica set is that all the pods are crashed, or that, you know, it's not making progress and the number of actual running replicas never climbs to the right number. Right now, it actually makes choices on the fly to, you know, create those replicas in other clusters to reconcile the problem. So we do need that status somewhere. Right now, that is cached in RAM in the controller. So the controller actually keeps an updated thing in RAM of the status of that object in each cluster, and uses that to decide where to put new replicas, etc. The model that you're suggesting, we would actually have a persisted on disk thing in etcd of that status, for example. And we would have to keep it consistent with the persisted on disk status in the cluster.
When you talk about persisting status, that's not really what I'm talking about, though. I'm talking about having the details necessary to propagate things, but not more than that. If the scheduler wants to store it, that's a decision it could make, but I don't think that's necessarily required.
Sure, I guess, yeah, one can decouple them.
I mean, to be clear, the reason I'm really sort of big on the decoupling is that for some use cases, having something that works as Federation V1 does today and kind of like does scheduling and propagation in line, that might make sense. And for simpler use cases, you know, maybe that isn't what happens, and it's a far simpler computation than happens.
Yeah, I'm conceptually, as I say, that was the original proposal I came up with, so I'm not opposed to it. I guess, and yeah, provisionally, let's decide that that's what we're going to do then, so we can move on. So there are going to be resources stored in the Federation control plane in etcd that will represent whatever some scheduler decided to do with a federated resource, and that scheduler may have been a human being. Or it may have been a piece of software, and it may or may not have, you know, it could have been very simplistic and not cared about quotas and liveness of clusters and all sorts of things, or it could have been very sophisticated and had all of that information and made the decision based on that. Seems reasonable.
Okay. Sorry, Paul, how long have you been holding your hand up?
A little while. I did not actually hold it up in real life. You covered most of what I was going to say. I do have a different point to make now, is that probably the placement and like placement, affinity of resources that travel together, I expect to be an area that is very likely that different folks will have different ideas. Again, I think the game there is like find the right primitives that we can compose, or that if you can compose in different ways to suit your fancy. So if we have a good starting point, I think that's progress to kind of iterate on and see how we like it once we have it to play with. EOF.
Sounds good. So one other thing that's missing from the document right now, and I'm not sure, I mean, this turns out to be reasonably tricky, is the weighting aspect. So at the moment we have for resource types that have a sort of a weight attached to them, replica sets being the canonical example. There's currently in the V1 implementation, there's a way of saying, you know, put half there and half there, or 2/3 here and 1/3 there. And that turns out to be really useful. And there's a default, which is, you know, just to spread it equally across things. So that's a pretty heavily used feature. And it doesn't really, it's not obvious to me how we take what's in the document at the moment with the cluster selector and we expand that to be able to cater for that fairly basic use case. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
That's actually covered further down.
Oh, it is.
Yeah,
Sorry.
like the placement was one thing, but then the scheduling, we kind of described it as scheduling preferences. So maybe you could speak to whether that's something that's in line with what you
where is that covered? Scheduling, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, so those are different than
Yes.
the placement preferences. Okay, so placement tells you which clusters, and scheduling tells you how much in each of those selected clusters.
Correct.
That sounds reasonable. Okay, I'll go and scrutinize this document a bit better than I have.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah, I mean the intent was trying to capture most of the stuff that the V1 API did, and if we missed something, please comment.
Okay.
So we seem to have some consensus on placement also as of now.
Yeah, it looks that way.
Yes.
I'm
reconciled in my head how consistent this, how decoupling this scheduling preferences are from the placement preferences. It seems like they would have to be kept consistent in the sense. So right now in the example document, the cluster selector says region equals US West, and the scheduling preferences say US East gets 5 and US West gets 5, let's say, or weight, relative weight. So that isn't going to work at the moment, I assume.
I think the idea would be, I don't actually have the doc open. Hold on.
We can go. We don't need to talk about it now, but I just put it there as a placeholder. Like I haven't reconciled those two things in my head yet, and the document doesn't seem to reconcile them yet. So we probably need to add some more.
I mean, to my mind, I'm not entirely sure how reconcilable they are. In the same way that I don't think they're really reconciled in Federation V1, because they can be like both in operation at the same time. But I could use, I guess the challenge for me is you could use placement without scheduling. And I guess I'm coming to think that maybe you're right, that you can't really use scheduling without placement. It's kind of implicit in scheduling, right? Is that your point?
Not necessarily, actually. So if I didn't have a placement thing and I had just a scheduling preference and it said total replicas equals 50 and cluster 1 gets 5 and cluster 2 gets 10. I mean, that seems to tell the scheduler, I mean, it determines exactly where things land.
I mean, it implicitly defines placement. I want you to go into this cluster and I want you to have these values.
Yeah.
But to me, like scheduling would drive like a placement decision, like not a placement directive. But I'm going to say you're going to go into this cluster, and these are the overrides you're going to have. Does that make sense? At least at a logical perspective, it's kind of hard to separate it from implementation, I know. But
I'm still not clear. So what you talk about, so there's a thing called a replica set scheduling preferences in the document.
Yeah.
Is that supplied by the user to?
Yes.
Okay, and that is separate than the thing that the scheduler generates to decide where to put things.
Yes.
And I guess there seems to be a lot of overlap between replica set scheduling preferences and cluster selection preferences, which is also, there's a concrete example on page, where is it? Whatever, 5-ish.
I think that's correct. And I think that's, like, it's kind of still a little bit muddy, but I guess in my way of thinking, there's some use cases that don't really require scheduling. Like I just want to stamp out identical copies, or I'm going to just hard code what the overrides are for replica count.
I think that's fine, but that's a third thing. That's neither of these things.
No, I'm not, sorry, I'm confused why there's 3.
So there's preferences as to which clusters I want to go into, right?
Correct.
And those are currently captured in kind federation placement.
Correct.
Here's a thing called a cluster selector saying anything that falls within any cluster that falls within this cluster selector, I want.
Correct.
And then there is the requirement to be able to determine the relative sizes of those placements. And that is currently in what is called federated, what do we call it? Replica set scheduling preferences.
Yeah.
And that also specifies a set of clusters and numbers of replicas that can go into those and or weights. And then there is a third thing, which I don't know that it's captured here, which is
It is though, which is the overrides. That's effectively the mechanism that you use to provide cluster specific, like say replica count for a resource type, is you would define a replica set override. You'd say for cluster X, I want 3 replicas. For cluster Y, I want 4 replicas.
Is that not replica set scheduling preferences, which has exactly those fields in it?
The difference is that replica set scheduling preferences is configuration for a scheduler to determine what the actual count will be for a given cluster. Whereas overrides is a way of the user defining any field that they want to change, not just replica count. They could say, I want to use this image in this cluster because it's a different region. I want to use, these labels because I label things a little bit differently in this, zone. It's just arbitrary. It just allows them to vary the configuration across clusters. But it's static. It's not like defined by a scheduler or any dynamic mechanism. It's just.
Okay. Maybe I should be concrete. I want to put my application in 2 clusters. I don't care which ones, as long as they're in America. And I want 2/3 in the one cluster and 1/3 in the other cluster. It's not clear to me how I specify that. It sounds like I need a replica set scheduling preferences to specify the 2/3, 1/3 requirement. And it sounds like I need a, what is it called? Placement preferences, I believe is what it's called.
So the idea behind...
To specify that I want it in the US somewhere.
Sorry, if I'm defining scheduling preferences and I'm saying I want, this many in this cluster and this many in this cluster, isn't my assumption is that the scheduler would determine placement, like that the user wouldn't be responsible for determining that. You would be saying, okay, I want X replicas in this cluster, X replicas in this cluster, set the placement so that it goes into the clusters that I'm setting the overrides on. So scheduling preferences configure the scheduler determines overrides and placement as a result of that configuration and the dynamic system state, if that is what it's doing. Does that make sense?
Maybe we should take it offline.
Okay. Sorry, I'm not sure
we're using different terminology.
Okay.
Yeah. I also think it's not super clear from this document at this point necessarily what the relationship of these pieces are to one another. And also, I wonder if that might be something that we can clarify. I personally feel like we are very much still trying to figure out exactly what the right API constructions are. So that should also be noted too.
And the
to
right
be clear, I
language.
don't have any philosophical objections to the direction it's taking. I just don't know how I would do a pretty basic thing with what's in the document right now. And I think that. But let me take it offline and see if I can figure it out from the document, or if I can put concrete questions in the document to clarify what I don't understand.
Okay.
And then I think we're out of time, right? Give or take a few minutes.
Yeah, we're just about at time.
Actually, I have a question about placement itself, the way we think we might be treating it now. But probably I'll reserve it and visit it in the next meeting if it's not solved. I mean, if I can't wrap my head around it until then.
Cool. Thanks
Okay,
for the time, guys. No,
Yep.
sorry. I was going to say,
So,
I thought that was a very useful discussion. So thank you.
Yep. Thanks a lot, everybody.
No, 1 minute, hold on. I think we skipped a meeting on Monday, and I remember last meeting, some guys like Paul mentioned that probably we shouldn't meet that often. And I think some people said, okay, let's meet this Monday. So should we continue Thursdays alone, or do we need to meet on Mondays also?
I think Thursday India time. So right now it's Wednesday in California.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Wednesdays alone, or?
I thought personally that we were making pretty good progress by having the Monday and Wednesday meetings, if people have the time for it. I would be in favor of Mondays and Wednesdays. Yeah.
Yeah, I've had much better throughput on things in group discussions when they happen more than once a week. That does make them very expensive, so we should pay attention to whether we think they're useful. But right now, I would say that it's been quite useful to have the twice a week discussions.
I think that's true,
Okay.
but I would say that this coming Monday is it a holiday for some people in the U.S.?
Yes, good point. I believe Red Hat is off Monday.
Well, let's skip this coming Monday, but maybe schedule it for the Mondays after that for maybe 3 or more until we've got stuff going. Yeah.
Yep. Sounds good.
Okay. Yep.
All right.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
Are there any action items by the next meeting? Anything anybody said they were going to do? Maru, I'd be kind of interested in getting a bit of information or having it out there about whether the FNOR stuff is ready for people to start prototyping on. I don't know if that's in a state yet that people can really start diving in and looking at it. But if it is, that would be interesting, I think.
Yeah.
I agree.
I think you might have missed me saying, but I'm more than happy to bootstrap anybody who wants to get started working with what I have. I mean, it should be possible to get new API types and play with propagation, because like getting a federation up and running is pretty easy in an integration test environment.
Awesome, thank you.
So as you're thinking there, Maru, that there would be, I mean, I know it's in your personal branch now, and it's probably not the right place for it if it's going to be the sort of commonly used playground-y thing. Do you have any thoughts? Do you want to stick it in the Federation repo as a, either a branch or a subdirectory? Or do you want to create a new repo, which I think is a little complicated right now because of organizational ownerships and things? I don't think it's very easy to create new repos that are affiliated with this project.
Yeah.
So I guess I think that I don't really want to put it in a Federation repo because it would really make vendoring hard. It also uses kind of a different infrastructure. It uses API server builder rather than having to rely on the cube like build and code generation mechanism. So it's way easier. As far as putting it like in a different repo, I think for now I prefer to just continue like soldiering on. And once we've reached a point where we're happy with what's going on, then figure out how to transition to that other thing. But in terms of like collaborating with other people, like I'm totally happy. I mean, I don't think this is something people are going to work on independently of coordinating with me. And I'd like to coordinate with whoever wants to participate. And if we want to do that, Git is kind of designed for this kind of thing. Like we'll just go back and forth between branches, and if something makes sense, we'll I'm totally happy to accept pull requests and whatever if we want to have a canonical place for it. But my goal isn't creating working code for users. It's just kind of a development test bed at this point.
Yeah. One potentially minor concern is I don't know whether, because it's your personal project, if there's issues around the Kubernetes community, the CNCF CLA and stuff like that. I don't know if that's actually a problem here, but I'd
We're
to
just
become a
throwing code
problem
at the wall. And, like, we're not releasing anything. To my mind, like, we're not going to get administrative until we have to.
The most important thing from a donation perspective is that I believe that it has to use the same license as the CNCF one. We've had in another SIG and service catalog, we've had a project from Microsoft donated to the service catalog repo, and the only real piece of legal stuff that we ran into was that the license had to be changed to the Apache one. And in this case, Microsoft's internal rules said that it was okay to change the license. I'm happy to do some talking to legal on our end to see if we need to, what I's and T's we need to dot and cross on that angle if we're concerned about eventual donation.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it'll be important to have a kind of, this is the thing that this SIG is using as the place to, get stuff working. And hopefully that, let's say Maru gets run over by a bus tomorrow, I would like to think that this SIG would continue using that and developing it into what will ultimately become V2.
Yeah. Okay, well, I can put that on my list of action items.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep.
Cheers, guys.
Bye.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.
See ya.